I'm not the kind of woman you'd expect to end up locked out of her own life. I'm 32 years old. A professional obituary writer. Yeah, that's a real job. It's one of those things people don't think about until they need it. I help families write final words for people they love and sometimes for people they don't. I've sat with strangers as they've cried, raged, or laughed nervously, trying to sum up an entire human life in 500 words. It's delicate, strange work, but it's honest. And it teaches you something no one tells you. Most lives don't end in neat little bows. They end in the middle of messy stories, unfinished conversations, unresolved feelings, and I guess I didn't expect mine to become one of them. My name is Emily Rhodes. If someone else were writing my obituary, they'd probably say I was fiercely independent, thoughtful, and a lover of language. Or maybe a creative soul with a sharp mind and a tender heart. But if my mother were writing it, she was dramatic, too sensitive. Always thought the world owed her something. I wasn't always estranged from my family. In fact, for a long time, I tried harder than anyone to hold us together. I was the middle child, the invisible string between my older brother Ethan and my younger sister Brooke. Ethan, the brainy one, now a tax attorney with a perfect jawline and a perfectly curated life. Brooke, the bubbly youngest, who could do no wrong. And me? I was the weirdo who stayed up writing poetry at 12, the girl who brought books to birthday parties, the one who asked too many questions at the dinner table. Our mom, Diane, ran the house like it was a military base. Her love came with conditions. Her silence was punishment. She believed in control, image, tradition. She smiled at the neighbors, but never hugged her kids unless someone was watching. Our dad, Paul, was quieter, softer. He used to sneak me peanut butter toast late at night when I couldn't sleep. I think he saw Merrily Saw me in a way Mom never could. He died when I was 20. Sudden cardiac arrest. One phone call in the middle of a final exam, and everything collapsed. He was gone. And with him, my only safe place in that house. After that, everything shifted. Mom stopped pretending to like me. Ethan stepped into Dad's shoes like he was auditioning for a part. Brooke cried a lot, but she had friends and distractions. I was just drifting. I moved out the next year and never really came back. But I kept trying. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday calls, I kept showing up. Even when it hurt. I don't think people understand how much effort it takes to keep loving a family that doesn't really see you. It's like watering a plastic plant and hoping it grows. But I held on. Because I thought maybe one day, I'd say something just right, do something just enough, and Mom would look at me with real pride in her eyes. Or at least something softer than judgment. I kept thinking that if I just worked harder, made more money, did more adult things, maybe she'd see me as worthy. So, I built a life. A strange, beautiful one. I worked my way up from local paper obits to freelancing for major funeral homes and private clients. I bought a tiny house with creaky floorboards and sun-drenched windows. I adopted a rescue dog named Bishop. I joined a grief support group, not just for myself, but because I felt more at home among the brokenhearted than anywhere else. I was building something that felt like peace. But family has a way of finding cracks in your foundation. There were warning signs, of course. Cold shoulders. Passive-aggressive texts. Brooke canceling plans last minute. Ethan talking to me like I was a teenager stuck in some creative phase instead of a grown woman with a mortgage and clients. And Mom, she perfected the art of exclusion. She once sent a group text about Ethan's promotion dinner, but forgot to include me. When I called her on it, she said, "Well, I just assumed you'd be too busy writing about dead people." I laughed it off. Because if I didn't, I'd cry. And crying was weakness. And weakness was ammunition. Still, I kept showing up. Because that's what good daughters do, right? And then, one Tuesday afternoon, as I sat in my car finishing notes from a meeting with a family whose matriarch had just passed, I got that text. Locks changed. You don't have a home anymore. Just like that. No explanation. No warning. Just a sentence that felt like a guillotine. I read it over and over. I even laughed one of those short, broken laughs that comes out when you're too stunned to cry. I stared at the little bubble, waiting for a follow-up message. An explanation. A typo. Anything. But nothing came. I tried calling. Straight to voicemail. I texted back. Is this some kind of joke? No answer. I refreshed. Waited, called again. Nothing. That night, I drove to the house. My childhood home. And found the porch light off. The blinds drawn, and the locks definitely changed. I stood on the porch for a long time, just breathing in the cold air and the sound of nothing. No television inside, no voices, just silence. And for the first time in years, I realized something. I had no idea what I'd done to deserve this. But I was going to find out. Because this wasn't just about a lock. It was about control. About silence. About a family with secrets they didn't want me to uncover. And I was done pretending I didn't see the cracks. When I couldn't get in the front door of my childhood home, something inside me snapped, but not the way you might expect. I didn't immediately cry or panic. Instead, I felt a heavy, hollow, calm settle in my chest, like the world had finally caught up to a truth I'd been whispering to myself for years. I was never truly welcome here. I paced the porch, running my fingertips along the cold wood of the railing, trying to pinpoint what I'd missed, what I'd done. My phone lay forgotten in my hand, the text from Mom still blinking at me like an accusation. I whispered to the night, "Diane, you can't do this. You're my mother." But the house stayed silent. Finally, I drove home and out theirs, mine, the one I'd worked so hard to make a sanctuary. But peace felt fragile now, splintered. I lay awake that night, mind racing. Fiancés I'd lost, house guests who'd never come, secrets I'd buried in middle-of-night journals. And above all, that shitty pang of shame you screwed up somehow. What did you do wrong, Em? The next morning, I sat down with my laptop at the kitchen table, trying to turn my panic into action. My fingers hovered over the keys before I typed a text meant for Mom, but I hesitated. I couldn't just ask, "What the hell is going on?" That felt too vulnerable. Instead, I wrote, "Please call me when you can. I need to understand." Mom didn't call back. But within an hour, my phone buzzed with a group text. Mom, Ethan, Brooke, everyone. Subject line, family discussion tonight. The message read, "We need to talk. Important. Please meet at Mom's at 6 p.m. My heart pounded. This wasn't an invitation. This was a summons, a condemnation. I paused, staring at the words as if they might morph into something less final. I closed my eyes and imagined what lay ahead: a living room full of eyes narrowing like knives, hidden glares behind poised smiles, rehearsed lines and consequences I couldn't predict. At 5:45, I pulled into the driveway. The house looked identical to every family gathering. Christmas lights strung haphazardly, my mom's orchids perched on the windowsill, like silent witnesses. But this evening felt like a trial. I carried a printed copy of my lease, bank statements, email threads, proof of my life, my adulthood, because I felt like I'd been erased from the beginning. At precisely 6, Mom opened the door, her expression unreadable. She wore her default mask-polished hair, muted perfume, that look of disappointed composure. Behind her, Ethan stood straight-backed in a charcoal suit, arms folded. Brooke hovered by the kitchen island, clutching her phone like a shield. I stepped inside, swallowed the draft of nostalgia, and braced myself. "Thanks for coming, Emily," Mom said flatly, ushering me into the living room. There was a coffee table strewn with documents, copies of wills, deeds, something else I couldn't yet see. The overhead light cast sharp angles across their faces, and I felt like I was walking into a courtroom. Mom gestured to a leather-bound book. "We're here to talk about our home." She nodded at Ethan. He shifted and said, "We've reevaluated the distribution of assets. We think it's best if things change." The locks were changed for everyone's protection. I felt warmth retreat from my face. Protection? Mom, you changed the locks on me. No warning. No, Temporarily, she said, her voice flat. Until we decide what's fair. I raised an eyebrow. Fair? You didn't talk to me, it just happened. She arched her chin. You've chosen distance, Emily. You haven't been around, you don't participate in family matters. You moved away. My throat tightened. I called every holiday, Barely, she interrupted. You were always busy with your work, with your clients. I stood, pacing by the window. Yes, I work, to support myself. I write obituaries, I pay my mortgage, I provide care for clients' families. What do you do with your time, Mom? Besides, tear me down at dinners? Ethan's face was taut. Easy, Em. Let's keep this civil. Brooke looked away, tears glistening. I don't want to fight. Her voice cracked. We should talk this out. Mom's lips tightened. Here are the documents. She slid a stack over to me. We need you to sign an acknowledgement that you agree to vacate the house by the end of the month. In exchange, you'll receive a cash settlement. I stared. A settlement? You're buying me off? No, Mom said curtly. We're compensating you for your share. As the middle child, you never engaged with the property. But legally, you still have rights. I flipped through the papers. They looked like legal gibberish terms I recognized but couldn't process under pressure. And if I don't sign? Ethan answered. You'll be in litigation. Court. Appraiser. Attorney fees, time-consuming and public. Brooke whispered, Mom doesn't want to take this to court. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply. Fine, I need time. 24 hours. My voice was small. Mom nodded curtly. 24 hours, then you decide. Later, I drove home numbly. My hands gripped the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. Court. Litigation. My home. I replayed the evening on a loop. The polished presentation, their measured words, that air of inevitability. They'd engineered exclusion and called it fairness. At home, Bishop greeted me at the door, his nails clicking on the wood floor. I collapsed onto the sofa with the documents in my lap, my legs trembling. This was real. I was really losing what I thought was mine. What I had built or thought I had. The physical house was a symbol. But what hurt most was the message. I didn't belong. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because they'd decided I didn't deserve it anymore. My phone buzzed. It was a group chat with 3 messages. Mom. Just sign the papers. This is best for everyone. Ethan. Think carefully, Em. Litigation would cost you much more than the settlement. Brooke. Please don't make this ugly. We love you. Brooke's message hurt more than all the rest. The conviction that she still loved me was a lie. The rest was just avoiding chaos. My mind raced. What could I agree to now, just to keep from going to court? Was it worth it? Was I becoming the person who signs away her rights under pressure? Because the truth is, I'm not sure I even know who I am without this house or without their approval. My phone fell silent, and hours passed in that stretch between evening and dawn. I couldn't work. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the documents laid out like grave markers. And in that dark quiet, I decided I would refuse. I may have lost their approval, but I still had myself. The next morning, I drove to the office of a real estate lawyer recommended by a colleague who once mentioned she'd fought a family for a property. The waiting room smelled like boiled coffee and cheap carpet. When the lawyer, a brisk woman named Janet Green, asked what I needed, I said, I want to see exactly what rights I have to fight this. She nodded. Tell me everything. I did. I told her about Mom's text, the locked doors, the meeting, the pressure, the rejection made official. She listened, typing notes, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she said, You have 2 options. You can fight in court for your share, which may take months or years and get messier. You can negotiate terms that satisfy both sides. It depends on one question. How much do you need this house? I stared at her like she was insane. The house was never Minot, really. The space between its walls was memories, parenthood, the ghosts of my dad. It was the lineage they were trying to strip me of. I need them to understand that I deserve a voice, I said, and it was true. More than a house, I wanted respect. I wanted to say to Mom, Ethan, even Brooke, you don't get to silence me. Janet looked at me carefully. Then you fight, and if they expect you to roll over, they're in for a surprise. And a flea. Back at my kitchen table that evening, I took a deep breath and drafted my response. Mom, I cannot sign those papers. I will protect my rights, legally and financially. I welcome a mediated discussion, proper and fair. But I will not be bought, silenced, or erased. Then I sent it. My phone glowed with uncertainty. Within minutes, Mom called. My stomach twisted until I answered. Emily, she said, her voice brittle. What are you doing? I'm standing up for myself. I replied, my voice firm. I won't sign. I want a mediated sit-down with a neutral party. There was a long silence. Then she said, You're being dramatic. You're making this into exactly what I've heard all my life, Mom, I interrupted. That I'm too dramatic. That I overreact. That I don't know how to be a daughter. I'm done letting you diagnose me instead of actually talking to me. Her breath hissed. You're threatening the family over a house. I almost laughed. No, Mom. You're threatening my place in the family over a house. She hung up. The click echoed through my eardrums. That night, I barely slept, but I didn't feel hollow anymore. I felt more like myself than I had in years. I wasn't sure what the next day would bring. It could be lawsuits, lawyers, numbers, but for the first time, I felt ready. Because the conflict wasn't about locks or real estate. It was about my right to exist in their world. And I wasn't going anywhere. I wish I could say that after I took a stand, someone in my family reached out with an olive branch. That someone knocked on my door with tears in their eyes and a trembling voice saying, I didn't know it had gone this far. But that moment never came. Instead, what followed was a silence so loud and heavy it felt like a casket being sealed, one slow turn of the screw at a time. And no matter how loud I screamed in my own head, I knew they'd already turned away from me. In the days that followed, I checked my phone obsessively, not because I wanted another fight, not because I was eager to rehash the betrayal, but because some part of me, some ancient, wounded part still clinging to childhood, believed that Brooke might text something small and true like, Are you okay? Or Ethan might call with his usual brisk tone disguising regret, saying, Let's be smart about this, But neither of them did, and it was that silence and not the legal threat, not even my mother's cold dismissal, that truly made me feel abandoned, because it meant I wasn't just in conflict with them, I was being exiled from them altogether. I kept remembering moments that didn't seem like much at the time but now glowed red in my memory, like warning lights I never noticed, like when Brooke got engaged and I found out through Facebook, or the time Ethan and Mom went to Florida to visit my aunt and didn't even mention the trip until weeks later, as if it had been a private world I wasn't allowed in. Or the countless holidays where I brought thoughtful gifts and watched everyone else unwrap things they clearly loved, while I got a candle or a clearance sweater and smiled anyway because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. It had been happening for years, this subtle, painful edging out, and yet I still blamed myself, still wondered if I was somehow the cause, if there was something about me that made it hard to love. If maybe I was too emotional, too dramatic, too much. I remembered one Thanksgiving, not too long after Dad died, when I'd tried to bring up a memory of him at the dinner table, just a small one, how he used to make a goofy turkey voice and pretend it was begging to be pardoned, and how Mom had said sharply, That's enough, Emily. Let's not linger on the past. And Ethan had cleared his throat while Brooke had looked down at her plate, and I had felt like I was the only one grieving in a room full of people pretending not to feel anything at all. That was always the dynamic, me feeling too much, them feeling nothing, or at least pretending to, and that divide had only deepened over time. Now, as I walked around my house, a place I'd once loved for its solitude, I felt the weight of that rejection settle over me like dust, gathering in corners I hadn't cleaned. In tea, mugs left half full on the counter, in Bishop's tired eyes when he watched me pace, confused by my mood swings and my muttering. I didn't know how to explain to anyone that I wasn't just fighting over a house. I was fighting over proof that I existed in their eyes, that I mattered beyond the polite distance they maintained with me. When I tried to talk about it with my friend Tessa over coffee one afternoon, she listened carefully, nodding as I spilled everything from the text to the meeting to the eerie stillness that followed. And when I finally paused, she said something that caught me off guard. "You know," she murmured, stirring her drink slowly. "This isn't about the house, Em. It's about what they've been trying to tell you for a long time, you just weren't ready to hear it." I looked at her, stunned. "Which is what?" "That you don't fit into the version of the family they want. You've outgrown it, and they don't know what to do with that." I opened my mouth to argue, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I had outgrown the roles they gave Meth, a black sheep, the disappointment, the strange one who could never quite settle down, and when I stopped playing along, when I stopped asking for permission to exist, they closed the door. What hurt most wasn't just the exclusion, it was the way they made it look like my fault, as if my independence was a betrayal, my boundaries a rebellion, my voice an offense. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for hours, remembering birthdays where my mother forgot my favorite cake flavor, group photos where I was always just slightly off to the side, family text threads where I was tagged as an afterthought, if at all. And I wondered if this was just how some families worked, that the more you try to be yourself, the more they push you out, until you either come crawling back, agreeing to be smaller, or walk away for good. I wasn't ready to walk away yet, but I was starting to understand why people did. I thought about my dad, about how he used to tell me, "You don't have to shrink for anyone, not even me," and how he'd call me his spark, his little comet, and how after he died, no one ever called me anything warm like that again. Without him, there had been no one to defend me at the dinner table, no one to say, "Let her speak," when Mom rolled her eyes, no one to nudge my hand under the table when I looked like I might cry. And now I was facing a family that had no room left for that spark. A family that had tried to snuff me out and act like it was for my own good. But I was still here. Still burning. Still unwilling to disappear. And though I didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of the fight to reclaim my place, not just in their world, but in my own story. It started with the silence, but what followed was worse, because silence can still leave room for hope. But what came next was a series of deliberate slights, cold omissions, and calculated decisions that made it painfully clear this wasn't just about a house or a misunderstanding. It was about control. And I was the one they were determined to erase from the narrative of our family's future, like a sentence they regretted writing. A week after I told my mother I wouldn't sign the agreement, I got a letter in the mail, not from her, of course, but from a lawyer I'd never heard of, a firm in the city that specialized in estate restructuring, and it was so clinical, so devoid of warmth or recognition, that reading it made me feel like I'd died and they were processing paperwork for the disposal of my memory. The letter stated that my mother and siblings were initiating a voluntary redistribution of assets due to a change in family circumstance, and that I had 10 business days to respond with documentation contesting the property claim, should I wish to retain any legal stake. 10 days. 10 days to prove that I belonged to something I was born into. I sat at my kitchen table, holding that letter like it might bite me, and as the ink burned into my mind, I realized they had gone past emotional distance into legal exile. They were rewriting history and cutting me out with the precision of people who had been planning this far longer than I wanted to believe. I imagined the conversations behind closed doors, the whispered strategy sessions. "She's always been difficult, let's just move forward without her." And the thought made my stomach turn, not just because of the betrayal, but because deep down, I had always suspected I wasn't really one of them. Not in the way Ethan was, not in the way Brooke would always be. I called Ethan, trying to speak calmly, trying not to let the tightness in my chest color my voice, but he answered with a clipped tone and said, "Em, if you've got something legal to say, put it in writing. That's how this works now." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. That's how this works now, as if decades of shared meals, scraped knees, and midnight talks could be replaced by lawyers and filings, as if our bond had never been anything more than a provisional agreement. And when I tried to reach Brooke, desperate to find a crack of compassion in her voice, she answered sounding tired, hesitant, and said, "I just don't want to be in the middle, Em. This whole thing's really stressing Mom out." As if her stress outweighed mine. As if my pain was a burden she didn't feel obliged to carry. Every attempt I made to reason with them was met with stone faces, polite refusals, and that slow, suffocating feeling of being shut out not just from the house, but from the very memory of who we used to be. I wasn't invited to Sunday dinners anymore, not that I'd always gone, but the invite had been a formality, a gesture, and now even that was gone. I stopped being tagged in family group messages, the ones where they shared photos of Ethan's kids playing in the yard I used to mow. Brooke's engagement photos under the same porch light where Dad used to wait for me to come home after curfew. And the worst came when I saw a post on social media, a simple one, a smiling photo of Brooke and Mom standing in front of a big banner that read, "Rhodes Family Home, New Chapter Begins." The caption was celebratory, full of vague joy and talk of blessings, and when I zoomed in, I saw that the living room behind them looked entirely different. The furniture was new. The carpet was ripped out. The walls were painted pale blue instead of the warm gold Dad had picked out because he thought it felt like sunlight. It was as if they had purged him from the house. As if they had purged me too. I sat there staring at that photo for a long time, my thumb frozen above the screen, and I felt a grief so dense and complicated I could barely breathe. Because it wasn't just about losing a place, it was about being replaced, erased, edited out of a story I helped write. That house had been my anchor in a sea of uncertainty, and they had sold it, changed it, and smiled for the camera without even blinking. When I finally spoke to my lawyer, her voice was measured but firm. "Emily," she said, "they're attempting to position you as a non-participant in the estate so they can consolidate ownership. If you want to fight this, you'll need more than emotion. You'll need paperwork, proof of your connection, contributions, anything that ties you to the home. But how do you prove that a place belongs to you when your name isn't on the deed? When your contribution was emotional labor, unpaid caretaking, the kind of invisible work that families rely on but never acknowledge?" I remembered the weeks after Dad died, how I was the one who made the funeral slideshow. How I stayed up for nights scanning old photos, calling relatives for stories. How I helped Brooke write her eulogy because she couldn't face it. How I held Mom's hand when she said she didn't know how she'd go on, and now, none of that mattered. There was no record of my grief, no evidence of my loyalty. And without it, I was just a name on the outside of the legal wall they'd built to keep me out. It was in those days that the bitterness began to take root, not because I wanted revenge not yet, but because I wanted recognition, and it was becoming clear that they had no intention of giving it to me. I began to write things down, all the small injustices that had piled up like dead leaves over the years, the times I'd been told to lower my voice, the times I was scolded for making things about me. The way Mom always turned Ethan's mistakes into lessons and mine into warnings. And maybe that's when I truly began to change, when I started looking at all of it not as a string of unfortunate events, but as a pattern, a deliberate effort to keep me small, compliant, ashamed. Because once you see the pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. Once you realize that love was conditional from the beginning, you stop trying to earn it. And something inside you begins to harden not into hatred, but into resolve. It's strange how hope can survive even in the most inhospitable places, like a dandelion pushing through a cracked sidewalk. And in those first few weeks after the betrayal was made official, after the legal letter arrived and the family photo was posted like a final verdict, I found myself clinging to that stubborn hope, not because I was naive, not because I believed everything could be fixed with a few phone calls, but because somewhere inside me, there was still a small voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, they didn't fully understand what they were doing. Maybe they were acting out of fear, maybe I could still be heard. So I started gathering every piece of evidence I could find, not just for the lawyer, not just for a courtroom, but for myself, for proof that I had belonged. That I wasn't some peripheral figure they could cut out without consequence, that I had given, supported, contributed in ways that mattered even if they were never acknowledged. I went through old bank statements, searching for the checks I'd written to cover part of Dad's medical bills when insurance fell short. I pulled up emails where I'd volunteered to stay with Brooke after her surgery. Printed out texts where Mom thanked me grudgingly for helping clean out the attic after Dad's death, a task neither Ethan nor Brooke had offered to do. And I made a list, a long, private list, of every birthday I'd remembered, every holiday I'd cooked for when Mom claimed she was too tired, every time I'd been the one to apologize first. Even when I wasn't wrong, every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace, because I thought that's what family was: compromise, resilience, unconditional love. But the more I wrote down, the more I began to realize how lopsided everything had always been, how recognition in my family was currency, and I had never quite earned enough of it, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how quiet I became to avoid conflict, no matter how much I sacrificed just to be seen. I started therapy again, not the casual check-ins I used to do, but deep, uncomfortable sessions that left me raw and exhausted, the kind that forced me to confront not just what my family had done, but what I had let them do, the boundaries I never set, the ways I trained myself to expect less and call it maturity. My therapist, a gentle but uncompromising woman named Rachel, listened carefully as I described the dynamics, the coldness, the favoritism, and when I paused, hesitant, as if maybe I was overreacting, she said softly, "Emily, you're not grieving a house, you're grieving the loss of the role you thought you played in their lives. You're realizing it was never what you needed it to be." Those words sat with me for days, like a stone in my pocket, and the more I thought about them, the more I understood that my fight wasn't just legal, it was existential. I wasn't just trying to get back into the house. I was trying to rewrite the story, to stop being the invisible daughter, the emotional liability, the one they always kept at arm's length, but called selfish whenever she reached for more. So I did something that scared me. I asked for a meeting. Not a confrontation, not a courtroom battle, but a real conversation with a mediator present, someone who could witness and hold the space without taking sides. Someone who could stop my mother from twisting the narrative into something that made her the victim and me the villain. I sent an email, calm and clear, outlining what I hoped we could discuss, what I was willing to consider, how I wanted to be treated. I waited 2 days before Ethan replied, saying he'd consider it, and another 3 before Brooke chimed in with a cautious, "If it'll help us all move forward, I'm open to trying." My mother never responded directly, but the mediator confirmed she'd agreed to attend. The day of the meeting, I arrived early, hands shaking, a folder in my lap filled with all the evidence I'd compiled, and a small photo tucked inside one of me and Dad from when I was 7, sitting on the front steps of the house with popsicles in hand, both of us smiling like we had the whole world figured out. I brought it not as a weapon, but as an anchor, a reminder of what I'd once felt, before everything became so tangled and conditional. They arrived together, my mother in a sharp navy blouse, Ethan in another tailored suit, Brooke looking pale and exhausted, and for a moment, I thought maybe something human would flicker in their eyes, some recognition that we were once more than adversaries, but if it was there, it was buried deep beneath the performance of politeness and distance. We sat in the softly lit room, the mediator opening with practiced warmth, and I spoke first not because I wanted control, but because I knew I wouldn't get another chance if I didn't take it. I told them how I felt left out, disrespected, blindsided. I named the moments they had ignored, the contributions they had dismissed, the pain of being cast out without a word. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I spoke like a woman who had finally learned that her voice mattered, even if no one listened. And when I finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner humming behind me. My mother adjusted her bracelet, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You always think everything's about you." I should have expected it, but it still hurt, and yet, I didn't crumble. Because this time, I wasn't trying to make them love me. I was asking for respect. The worst part about confrontation isn't the yelling, or the accusations, or even the silence that follows. It's that moment when you realize they aren't hearing you. That they've already decided who you are and what you mean to them. And no matter how carefully you choose your words, how much restraint you summon, how deeply you open your chest to offer them the raw truth of your hurt, they won't take it because it doesn't fit the version of events they've chosen to believe, the version that lets them sleep at night and call it peace. After the mediation, things didn't simmer down, they boiled over in slow motion, the way lava creeps before it swallows everything. Because though no one shouted across that quiet table and no one stormed out, there was something far more sinister in the aftermath, a cold, deliberate withdrawal that spread like frostbite, touching every thread of connection I still had with them and snapping them one by one. Ethan was the first to follow up, not to extend a hand, not to acknowledge the pain in my voice or the dignity with which I tried to hold my ground, but to send a carefully worded email, stiff and full of legalese, reminding me that, while personal emotions are valid, property matters must remain objective, and attaching another round of documents with language designed to intimidate. Partition, valuation dispute, ownership dilution, words that were clearly meant to scare me into retreat, to push me back into the corner they preferred I stay in, quiet and grateful and out of the way. Brooke, on the other hand, didn't write or call. Instead, I found out through a mutual friend that she'd posted a lengthy message on her private Instagram account, one I hadn't been blocked from yet, a thinly veiled diary entry about toxic people who weaponize the past, and how sometimes you have to set boundaries with family for your own mental health. And I stared at that caption for what felt like hours, rereading the comments from her friends who had no idea what had really happened, offering affirmations like, "So proud of you for protecting your peace," and "You don't owe anyone your energy." And I wanted to scream, not because I disagreed with boundaries, but because they had stolen mine and then painted me as the invader. It was like watching my name get twisted in real time, turned into a cautionary tale, the ungrateful daughter, the dramatic sister, the one who made everything about her. And the more they repeated it to themselves, to each other, to the online world, the more I realized they weren't just defending their decisions. They were rewriting the narrative so thoroughly that by the time they were done, they could call it healing and no one would question them. Even my mother, the architect of this whole disaster, didn't reach out directly, but she didn't need to know when I began receiving cryptic, clipped messages from distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly texting me things like, "Hope you find peace in your heart," or "I'm sure your mom did what she thought was best." And I could feel the judgment simmering beneath their vague concern, the implication that I was unhinged, unstable, ungrateful for whatever scraps I had been offered, and it made me wonder how long this campaign had been going on behind my back. How many stories had been spun to justify what they'd done? How many half-truths had turned into gospel over coffee and passive-aggressive phone calls? One night, I drove past the old house, my house, our house, and for the first time, I parked across the street and just sat there, engine idling, lights off, heart pounding like I was doing something wrong. And I watched as the porch light flicked on, and a group of people I didn't recognize walked in with laughter and wine bottles, and I realized they had turned it into something else entirely, maybe a rental, maybe some Airbnb fantasy for strangers to walk through rooms where I used to dream and cry and hope for a version of love that didn't hurt. And the sight of those strangers crossing the threshold like it had never belonged to me made something inside me collapse, not with fire, but with the slow ache of finality. I drove home in silence, and when I walked through my door, my real door, to the life I had built alone, I didn't cry, not yet, not even when Bishop laid his head on my knee and looked up with those big, knowing eyes. But I felt it rising, that deep, suffocating grief that wasn't about property or legality or fairness anymore, but about the unbearable realization that my family didn't see me as one of them anymore, that they had chosen a version of themselves that didn't include me, and I didn't know if I could ever find a way back from that. The next morning, I received a letter, again through the lawyer, not electronic this time, but printed, sealed, hand-delivered, as if to make it feel more official, more irreversible. It was a formal notification that they were proceeding with a forced sale of the property and offering me a final buyout that was, frankly, insulting, a fraction of the house's value, a sum that might have worked in a world where I was desperate and small and too tired to fight. And that's when something in me snapped, not in rage, but in resolve, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers steadily, number. Not like this. Not without a voice, not without truth. I walked to my kitchen, brewed a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and started typing not a letter. Not a legal response, but a statement of facts, of history, of truth. A record of everything I had been to this family, every role I had played, every moment they had depended on me without thanks, every betrayal masked as boundary, every gift taken and rebranded as obligation. I didn't know what I would do with that document yet, but I knew it had to exist, because I couldn't let them write the ending for me. Couldn't let their silence be the last word. And even if I never got their recognition, even if they never said sorry or admitted they were wrong, I would have something they could never take from Mimi's story, in my voice, without apology. And somewhere in that quiet, something stronger than grief began to grow in anger that wasn't destructive but necessary, a fire that wasn't burning everything down, but lighting the path forward. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't feel like silence, or stillness, or the absence of people. It feels like being surrounded by noise that you can't reach. Like pressing your hands to a glass wall while your family laughs on the other side, like screaming in a room full of familiar faces and realizing no one is turning their head. And that kind of loneliness isn't just painful, it's humiliating, because it strips you down to the raw truth that no matter how much you gave, no matter how long you stayed, they were always looking for a reason to let you go. The days after that final letter, the one with the insultingly low buyout, the one that read more like a threat than an offer, blurred together in a gray stretch of time where every hour felt longer than the last. And nothing I did seemed to matter, because I was operating in a reality that no longer acknowledged me, like someone trying to speak in a dream where no sound comes out. And everything I thought I knew about loyalty and fairness felt distant, childish, naive. I stopped answering texts, even from friends, even from Tessa, who kept checking in with cautious optimism, sending voice notes that ended with, "I love you, M. You're not alone." But the words bounced off me like light on ice, because loneliness at that depth is not about being forgotten, it's about believing, truly believing, that you are unworthy of being remembered. I stopped writing for a while, too, which for me is like cutting off circulation. Like closing the only window in a room that's already suffocating, because writing had always been how I processed pain, how I made sense of death and disappointment, but now I couldn't find the words, not even for myself. Every sentence felt flat, performative, dishonest, because what I really wanted to write was something primal and selfish and messy, something that said, I hate them for what they've done. But I was too ashamed to admit that even to the blank page. I didn't recognize myself during that time. I stopped wearing makeup, stopped cleaning the house, let dishes pile up in the sink until Bishop barked at the smell, and I would lie on the couch for hours. Not sleeping, not even really thinking, just existing in that heavy numbness that comes when grief stops crying and starts calcifying in your bones. And sometimes I would stare at the door, half expecting someone to knock and say, "This has all gone too far." But of course, no one came. The nights where worse nights are always worse because there's no distraction, no email to answer or document to sign, no polite performance to maintain, just the long, slow spiral of thoughts you can't outrun. Maybe they were right. Maybe I am the problem. Maybe I should have just signed the paper. Maybe I'm not the kind of person people fight for. Maybe I never was. And that spiral is cruel, because it doesn't come in a storm, it comes like a slow drip, a quiet leak, until suddenly you're drowning and you can't even remember when you first felt wet. One night, sometime around 2 a.m, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, just staring at my own reflection, and I looked. Ghostly, hollow-eyed, like someone who had wandered out of her own body and forgotten the way back, and I touched my face like it belonged to someone else and whispered, "What is wrong with me?" And I meant it, not in anger, but in genuine confusion. Because when the people who raised you tell you with their actions that you are unlovable, untrustworthy, not worth keeping, eventually you start to believe it. I thought about calling my therapist, but even that felt like a burden, like I didn't deserve her time. And the next day, I stared at her number for 15 minutes before finally pressing delete. Not because I didn't need help, but because I didn't think I was allowed to ask for it anymore. Not when everyone else seemed to agree that I was the issue, the disruption, the one who refused to let go. And then something small happened, insignificant, really, but it cracked something open. I was sorting through a box of old things, trying to clean, to feel useful again, when I found a letter from my dad, handwritten on yellowed paper, one I had tucked inside a journal years ago and forgotten. And it was nothing profound, just a note he'd left in my dorm room after he helped me move in. I know you feel out of place sometimes, but don't let that make you forget who you are. You're the spark in this family. Don't ever let them dim you. I stared at those words until my eyes blurred. And then I cried. Not the controlled tears I'd learned to shed in therapy, not the polite sobs I allowed myself when people were watching. I cried like I was breaking apart, like I was coming undone from the inside out. And I sobbed into the crook of my arm until my chest ached and my voice disappeared. And when it was over, when the tears stopped, not because I felt better, but because I had nothing left, I sat there on the floor, empty and quiet and strangely still. But in that stillness, I finally understood something I hadn't been able to grasp before, not with logic, not with strategy, but with that deep knowing that lives in the body when everything else has shut down. And what I knew was this. I was not grieving them. Not really. I was grieving the version of me who had spent her whole life trying to earn their love. And now that she was gone, I had to decide who I wanted to be without her. The turning point didn't come with a sudden burst of clarity or some grand revelation like you see in movies. It came slowly, like morning fog lifting over water, quiet and almost imperceptible. Until suddenly I could see what had always been right in front of me but just out of reach. And when it came into focus, it didn't make me feel victorious, it made me furious. Because it meant that everything I'd been suffering wasn't just personal, it was calculated, premeditated, cold in a way I didn't want to believe my family was capable of being. It started with a box. An old one, tucked in the back of my closet, left over from my move 3 years ago, filled with documents I hadn't thought about in age-stacks forms, dusty folders, and at the bottom, a small envelope with my name written in Dad's handwriting, sealed and slightly faded with age. My breath caught when I saw it, because I hadn't remembered this letter existed, but as soon as I held it in my hands, I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the one that always came when something of his found its way back to me, and with shaking fingers, I opened it. Inside was a simple, 2-page letter, dated just 6 months before he died. In it, he wrote about the house. He wrote about how he knew it meant different things to each of us, how he wanted it to be a place of belonging for all 3 of his children, but especially for me, because he saw how often I felt like an outsider, how often I stood on the edges of conversations, trying not to take up space, and he wanted me to know that I had just as much right to that home as anyone else, not because I paid more or did more, but because I loved more, and that should count for something. And then, in the final paragraph, he said something that made my hands tremble. He said he had updated the trust. He wrote, "I've spoken with the attorney, and I'm making sure your name is on the property in equal standing. I don't want there to be confusion later. If anything happens to me, I want you to be protected." I read it 3 times, my pulse pounding louder with each pass, and then I tore through the rest of the box, searching for the trust documents he'd mentioned, any scrap of proof, and finally, I found a faded photocopy of an amended document, notarized, dated, and, in the corner, written in fine print, my name listed alongside Ethan's and Brooke's. I sat there on the floor in stunned silence, the implications crashing over me in waves. Because this wasn't just sentiment, this was legal, this was binding. And if this version of the trust had been filed and logged properly, then what they were doing now wasn't just exclusion, it was fraud. Suddenly, the vague legal terms in Ethan's letters made more sense. Their push for a buyout, their insistence that I had no standing, their rush to finalize everything without court involvement. They weren't just trying to avoid conflict, they were trying to erase my rights entirely, hoping I'd be too tired, too isolated, too broken to dig into the past. But they'd underestimated me. I brought the documents to my lawyer the next morning, hands still trembling, heart pounding, and when she saw the letter from my dad and the notarized trust amendment, her eyes widened with something I hadn't seen from her before: actual surprise. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "If this was filed, and if we can verify that it wasn't revoked or superseded by a later version, then you're not just entitled to a share, you're a co-owner. They cannot legally sell or reallocate anything without your consent." I could barely breathe. We launched an investigation that same week, retrieving legal filings, requesting copies from the county records, digging into the attorney who had handled Dad's estate, and slowly, piece by piece, the full picture emerged. After Dad's death, my mother had met with a new estate attorney and filed a revised version of the trust that omitted my name. A version signed only by her and witnessed by Ethan, filed just 4 weeks after the funeral, and my heart shattered when I saw the date. Because I remembered that time, I remembered her sitting me down in the kitchen and telling me I needed to give her space, that I was suffocating her with my emotions. And I remembered Ethan hovering nearby, quiet but cold, and now I realized what they were really doing behind those closed doors. They had erased me. Not because I didn't belong, but because they didn't want to share. Because I was the least likely to fight. Because love, in their version of this story, had always been conditional and I had never been quite obedient enough. I stared at those documents for a long time before finally looking at my lawyer and saying, "We go to court." Ugh. And as the words left my mouth, I felt something rise inside me. No rage, not even grief, but clarity, the kind that only comes when you stop begging to be seen and start insisting that your truth matters. The kind that comes when you realize that being the quiet one, the emotional one, the too much one, doesn't mean you don't have power, it means you have depth. And depth is something they never learned how to navigate. They thought they could outmaneuver me with shame and silence. They thought they could count on me to fold. But my father knew me better than they did. He knew I was a spark. And now that I had truth on my side, I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was fighting for the version of me that he believed in, the one they tried to bury. There's a kind of stillness right before a confrontation that doesn't feel quiet at all. It hums beneath your skin like static, like an electrical wire fraying in your chest. And on the morning I walked into that courtroom, I wasn't calm, I wasn't angry, I wasn't even afraid. I was vibrating with something deeper than any of that. A mix of grief and fury and aching clarity that this moment, this face-to-face reckoning, wasn't just about property or paperwork. It was about everything they'd tried to deny me and the fact that I was still here, still standing, still refusing to vanish quietly like they'd hoped I would. We'd filed the suit 2 months prior, and finally, the hearing had been set. A petition to contest the modified trust, to bring forward evidence of my legal standing and expose the discrepancies in the documents my mother and Ethan had submitted after my father's death. And while it wasn't a trial yet, it was enough to bring us all into the same room under oath, enough to force them to acknowledge me not as the dramatic sister or the difficult daughter, but as a rightful stakeholder they couldn't just sweep under a rug and silence with a text message. I walked into the courthouse flanked by my attorney, papers in hand, wearing the same navy blue blazer I'd worn to my first ever funeral as a professional writer. The one that made me feel like I knew who I was even when everything else fell apart. And when I entered that cold, high-ceilinged room and saw my mother seated at the front, back straight, expression unreadable, and Ethan beside her with his phone turned over and his jaw clenched tight, something inside me settled, not in comfort, but in resolve, because I wasn't here for their forgiveness or their acceptance anymore. I was here for truth. Brooke was there too, seated just behind them, her hands knotted in her lap, eyes flicking to mine and then away like a guilty child caught in the middle of a fight she wanted no part of. And for a moment, I felt that old pull in my chest, the instinct to make it easier for her, to soften, to look away, but I didn't, because I had softened too many times, and softness was not what would win this war. The judge opened with formalities, motions, statements from both sides, and as my attorney laid out the timelining my father's original trust, the amendment naming me as an equal beneficiary, the letter he wrote, the notarized documents, the sudden revision after his death without proper disclosure, me heart didn't pound, it thundered. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that everything I had been gaslit into questioning about myself, my memory, my value, my place was real, and I was no longer the only one saying so. Ethan stood to respond, his voice flat, mechanical, and he said things like procedural misunderstanding and posthumous estate review, and it became clear he wasn't just defending himself, he was trying to maintain the illusion of control, of moral high ground, of quiet authority that couldn't be touched by sentiment or emotion. But as he spoke, the cracks began to show. His hands twitching slightly as he turned the pages, the subtle glance toward my mother when he stumbled over a phrase, and I realized, with a kind of cold awe, that they hadn't expected it to get this far. They'd counted on my collapse. Then my mother was called to speak. She rose slowly, deliberately, and when she took the stand, she didn't look at me en sonat when she said that the house had always been intended for Ethan to manage, not when she claimed she had no recollection of the amendment my father made, not when she described me as emotionally distant and frequently absent from family matters. And each word hit like a slap, not because it was painful, but because it was so carefully rehearsed, like she'd been waiting years to justify my exclusion. And I wondered how long she'd been writing this version of events in her head. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, palms clammy, voice tight, but I did not shake. I looked directly at the judge, then at my mother, and I told the story not just of the documents and the trust and the letter from my father, but of the birthday dinners I wasn't invited to, the times I was told to stop making everything about me when I tried to grieve, the family group messages that carried on without me, the home that was changed and photographed and celebrated online like I had never set foot in it. I said, this isn't about money, this is about identity. This is about being erased by the people who should have protected me. My father gave me this house in trust, not just in the legal sense, but in the human one, and the people who should have upheld that promise decided instead to rewrite history. Oh. There was a silence afterward that felt deeper than the kind I'd known before, not absence, but reckoning, and I knew that even if the judge didn't rule today, even if the outcome would take weeks or months, something had shifted in that room, because I had spoken my truth, out loud, where they could not talk over me, where they could not twist my words into hysteria or shame, and for the first time, they had to sit and listen. When we exited the courtroom, no one looked at each other. My mother walked ahead, Ethan trailing slightly behind, his face pale and drawn, and Brooke paused near the door, just long enough to whisper, "I didn't know about the letter." I nodded. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. We both understood that this wasn't over, not the legal fight, not the emotional fallout, but it was no longer hidden, no longer buried beneath layers of silence and performance and politeness. The truth was out, and the silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It was waiting for whatever came next. Victory didn't come with applause, or hugs, or even the kind of justice that makes you weep with relief. It came weeks later in the form of a quiet letter, stamped and clinical, from the court confirming the decision to reinstate the original trust, upholding my legal status as an equal beneficiary, invalidating the revision made without proper notification, and acknowledging the documentation submitted by my father before his death as binding and final. And though the words were formal and stripped of drama, they landed in my chest like thunder, not because they fixed everything, but because they proved I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't invented my father's love. I hadn't exaggerated the betrayal. I hadn't been dramatic or unstable or emotional beyond reason. The judge's ruling also came with a consequence, in order for a full audit of the estate management following my father's death, which meant that for the first time, Ethan would have to account for every decision, every dollar, every conversation he'd had with the attorney who helped rewrite the trust, and the audit revealed things none of us had expected. discrepancies in the valuation of the home, quietly transferred accounts that had once been earmarked for emergency family use, and most damning of all, an email from Ethan to that same attorney discussing how to minimize exposure to the middle beneficiary, which the court noted in its summary as evidence of intent to circumvent equal standing. Oh, when the ruling was read aloud in the final hearing, I didn't look at my mother. I watched Ethan, because in that moment, the certainty in his face cracked for the first time. And I saw something real beneath the arrogance. Not guilt, not even regret, but disbelief that his version of events hadn't held. That the performance he'd so carefully maintained had faltered under the weight of evidence and truth. And when the judge instructed him to begin reparative mediation or face a prolonged litigation process, he didn't argue. He just nodded once, curtly, like someone conceding not just defeat but exposure. My mother didn't speak to me afterward. She didn't congratulate me or apologize or meet my gaze when we passed in the hallway, but she didn't deny it anymore either. And that, in its own twisted way, was a kind of vindication, because silence had always been her weapon, and now it was no longer mine to suffer under. Brooke sent a text that night. Just 4 words. "You were right. Sorry. Action." And I stared at it for a long time, not because it made things better, but because it was something small, imperfect, human, and I didn't know yet if it was the beginning of anything, but I knew it was no longer nothing. I sat on my porch that evening, the sky soft with the colors of early summer. Bishop curled at my feet, the court letter folded neatly in my lap, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt still not triumphant, not healed, but anchored, like the world had stopped spinning long enough for me to breathe without defending my right to exist. And I knew, in that moment, that the fight had not been in vain. They had tried to erase me, but I had written myself back in. Healing didn't arrive like sunlight pouring through an open window. It came slowly, in slivers, in small, almost imperceptible moments that I only recognized later, like the way I stopped flinching when the phone buzzed, or how I began sleeping through the night without dreams that left me gasping, or the quiet shift in my body the first time I walked past the old house without stopping to look, without feeling that old ache of longing or betrayal clinging to my ribs like wet fabric, because somehow, in the stillness that followed the storm, I had learned to carry my story not as a wound, but as a scar that no longer burned when touched. I didn't rebuild my family, at least, not in the way most people would hope for, not with holiday dinners or tearful reconciliations, but I did begin to build something else, something gentler, something more honest. I started saying yes to new people, to friendships that weren't laced with obligation or history, to clients whose grief echoed my own, but who looked at me not as someone too emotional, but as someone brave enough to speak of death and loss without blinking. And in that work, I found a kind of kinship that blood had never given me. I redecorated my house not out of necessity, but because it felt good to change something on my terms, to make the walls speak in my voice, to hang photographs that reminded me of laughter and survival instead of expectation and shame. And every choice I made, every lamp, every cushion, every frame, felt like a line in a new story that I was finally writing from the center instead of the margins. And as I filled those rooms with light, with music, with people who knew my name because they wanted to, not because they were bound to, I felt a quiet kind of freedom settle into my chest, not the loud, defiant kind, but the steady kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone to rescue you and realize that, all along, you've been building the boat yourself. Brooke visited Ensenat with a grand apology, but with a pie and a nervous laugh, and we sat on the porch with Bishop at our feet and talked about nothing for a long time before she finally said, "I miss Dad too." And in that moment, something in me softened, not enough to forget, but enough to forgive. Enough to see her not as the sister who failed me, but as a girl who had also been lost in our mother's cold universe, just in a different orbit, and maybe that was enough for now. My mother never reached out, and eventually, I stopped expecting her to. Some truths you have to live with, not because they're fair, but because they are. And, in accepting that, I found peace, not the kind that comes with justice, but the kind that grows when you stop reaching for what doesn't exist and start nourishing what does. I still write obituaries, still sit across from strangers and ask them to tell me who someone really was, and every time I do, I think about my father and the letter he left. And I remember that love doesn't disappear just because people do. It lingers in the choices we make when no one's watching, in the names we refuse to forget, in the fight we finally choose to stop losing. And this quiet life I've built, this home that holds only truth is mine. Not because they gave it to me, but because I claimed it. If you had asked me at the beginning of this story what I wanted, what I truly needed, I might have said justice, or validation, or even love. But sitting here now, looking back at the wreckage and the rebuilding and the spaces that grew between us like quiet oceans, I realize what I was really fighting for all along wasn't their approval or some picture-perfect family reunion, but the simple, almost sacred right to exist without apology, to take up space without being questioned, to speak without being silenced, to be hurt and still be worthy of belonging. There is something indescribably painful about learning that your greatest wound was never your fault, that the shame you carried in your bones like second skin was handed to you, not born from you, and that so much of the pain you swallowed quietly in childhood had nothing to do with who you were and everything to do with who they needed you to be. And the freedom that comes from that realization is not joyous at first. It is hollow and terrifying, because if it was never your fault, then all those years you spent trying to be good enough were wasted on people who never intended to see you clearly. But eventually, the hollow starts to fill with truth, with clarity, with something sturdier than hope. It fills with the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who only know how to love you in pieces. It fills with the strength to say, I am not broken because I feel deeply. I am not unworthy because I say no. I am not wrong for wanting softness where there was only survival. And once you know that, once you stop shrinking to fit into the versions of yourself that made them more comfortable, you begin to meet yourself differently. You start asking new questions. What do I need? What do I want? What does peace look like when no one is watching? You begin writing your story not from a place of defense, but from a place of intention. You build a life where the love is chosen, not coerced, where the people who show up do so with both feet, not out of obligation but out of understanding. And maybe you never get the apology you deserve. Maybe your mother never calls. Maybe your brother still tells people you were difficult. Maybe your sister only speaks in half-truths and old memories. But you are still whole. You are still here. You are still worthy. Because families don't define you, stories do. The ones you tell yourself. The ones you choose to carry forward. The ones you finally set down and walk away from. And this story, the one you've listened to, the one I've finally told all the way through, is no longer about what they took from me. It's about what I reclaimed. My voice. My name. My right to be the one who stays.